Good evening, everybody. We are pleased to host today's lecture Professor Patricia Kelly from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. She is coming to us as a distinguished lecturer of the Paleontological Society. And if this is a 100-year-old society whose goal is to promote the science of paleontology. If some of you don't know what paleontology is, the paleontology devotes itself to studying the development of life on Earth using the fossil record, the record that is preserved in rocks under the surface of the Earth. Professor Kelly is, her visit is co-sponsored by the Department of Geological and Atmospheric Sciences, as well as the Miller Lecture Fund of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and is part of the Iowa State series that is called Women in STEM. Again, if some of you don't know what STEM is, it's Women in Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics. So that's part of that series. Professor Kelly got her master's and PhD from Harvard University. She is Fellow of Geological Society of America. She is Fellow of Paleontological Society. She is Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And today, the subject of her lecture is her latest research, or her main line of research. What she does is she's trying to bridge the gap, the divide between the fact and the acknowledgement of evolution and the traditional great religious beliefs. And that is going to be the subject of Professor Kelly's lecture. Please welcome Professor Patricia Kelly.
Thank you, Igor. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, all right. Well, it's very exciting to be in Iowa on the coldest day of the winter so far. And why does someone from North Carolina come to Iowa in January? That's a good question. I don't know, but I did live in North Dakota for 5 years, so I'm up to this. Okay. All right. Well, as Igor was saying, I'm a paleontologist, so I study fossils, the remains of ancient organisms preserved in the rock record of the Earth. For almost 35 years now, my specialization has been the evolution of mollusks, clams, and snails, mostly from sediments up to 80 million years old along the Gulf and the Atlantic coast, although actually here I'm doing fieldwork in Iceland. So that's what I do. I study and teach evolution. That's what I do during the week. Now, my husband's a Presbyterian minister. I'm a person of faith. I've been active in his ministry for the last 35 years. I've taught Sunday school for most of the last 35 years. I said 35 years, not 35 million years, right? Sometimes I get the two mixed up. Yeah, except when we lived in North Dakota, my husband preached at 3 different churches every Sunday morning, and so I didn't have time to teach Sunday school. I was too busy going to church. Now, when people hear this about me, they want to know, what's wrong with me? Am I insane? And maybe this goes back to the question of what is a North Carolinian doing in Iowa in January? People want to know what's wrong with me. How do I reconcile what I do on Sunday morning with what I teach and study during the week? So that's my question for tonight. Are creation and evolution conflicting, as many people assume, or is there a valid way to reconcile the two? So, I accept evolution as the explanation for the history of life because, in my judgment, there's abundant evidence for it, both from fossils and from living organisms. And so part of what I'm going to do tonight is share some of that evidence with you. I'm going to argue that evolution is the only valid scientific explanation for the history of life. And to explain what I mean by that, I want to start off by talking about what science is. Now, science is not just a collection of facts about the natural world, like the moon has a diameter of 2,159 miles, and it's 238,854 miles from the Earth. If that were science, it would be really boring to study it, and it would be really boring to teach it. But instead, science consists of a tightly integrated set of facts and theories attained through a very specific way that has come to be known as the scientific method. So first of all, scientific explanations have to be natural. We can't have supernatural explanations. So when we look at a natural phenomenon, like the Grand Canyon will be my example here, our explanations have to be natural. So a natural explanation for the Grand Canyon would be that it was carved by the Colorado River. The hypothesis that it was dug by 40,000 angels with silver shovels would not be considered scientific because it invokes the supernatural. We'll come back to why that's important in a little bit. Now, the ideas of science also have to be derived in a very specific way, what we call the scientific method. So facts are obtained by observing or measuring natural or experimental phenomena, and then hypotheses are constructed to explain the fact. And ideally, we want to propose several hypotheses for a set of facts. So in the case of the Grand Canyon, other scientific hypotheses could be that it was dug by a glacier. You guys know about glaciers. This whole part of Iowa has been glaciated, so that's good. Even if you're not geologists, you've heard of glaciers. Another explanation might be that it was formed by an earthquake, anything that would produce a big hole in the ground. So we take those hypotheses and we draw predictions from them. And the predictions could be about future events or about future observations of evidence of past events. Then we go out, we collect more data to test these hypotheses, and if the data don't confirm a hypothesis, the hypothesis collapses, and then it has to be rejected or modified. And there's often anguished reassessment that goes on. Because maybe you did the test wrong, maybe you did the wrong test, or maybe there really was something wrong with your hypothesis. However, if a hypothesis survives repeated attempts to disprove it, and if we are able to reject alternative hypotheses, then we can elevate our hypothesis to the status of a theory. Now, this is my son, who is, in my metaphor, building the original hypothesis, and now here he is 20 years later. That's to emphasize that sometimes it just takes time to test a hypothesis. Maybe you don't have the right technology to start with. Maybe it just takes a long time to collect the data. So this process of testing and rejecting or confirming hypotheses may take some time. But the work of science is embodied in hypothesis testing. And in order to be scientific, our ideas have to be testable against the natural world. Now, what that means is that there has to be a way, some line of evidence conceivable that could possibly, that could contradict that hypothesis, could falsify it. So our ideas have to be testable. And the idea that the Grand Canyon was carved by the Colorado River is testable, even if no one was there to see it, because we can go out, we can observe modern rivers, watch them erode their banks, measure the amount of sediment they carry, etc. On the other hand, the idea that the Grand Canyon was dug by angels is not testable. I can't think of any way to scientifically study the power of an angel. I can't make an angel materialize and measure how fast it can dig. So, theories that, I won't even use the term theory, ideas that invoke the supernatural can't be used in science because there's no way to test them. It's not because scientists are atheists, anything like that. We just have to be able to test our hypotheses or we're not doing science. Maybe 40,000 angels did dig the Grand Canyon. I can't disprove it, but it's not worth talking about in a geology class. How many of you are Geology 100 students? Yeah, okay. Your teachers haven't told you about angels digging the Grand Canyon, right? Okay, it's not worth talking about. You can't test it. Okay, so let me summarize. Here's your take-home points here. Science involves only natural explanations. It involves a very specific methodology that I've outlined for you. And in science, our conclusions are tentative. What that means is that we should never say that something is proven in science. It always has to be open to further testing. Our theories, that we can call them theories if they get enough support, but they always have to be open to more testing. Okay. So, what this means is that science and religion are different in terms of what their focus is, what their basis is, their ability to use the supernatural, their testability, etc. So science and religion are simply different ways of knowing. Just to clarify, then, a couple more terms. Facts. Facts are the observations of natural or experimental phenomena. Hypotheses are the way we explain those facts. Theories are well-tested hypotheses, but we should never call a theory a fact. Theories don't become facts. They always have to be open to further testing. Okay, so where does evolution stand in all this? Is evolution a fact or a theory? Well, I am going to argue tonight that evolution is a fact and that it's also the only viable scientific theory for the history of life. So let me explain what I mean. In its simplest usage, evolution means change in life through time. And in this sense, we can view evolution as a fact. It's a fact that organisms have changed over time. And there are two sources of evidence for this that I'm going to be talking about. One is direct observation during historic time through laboratory tests, breeding and hybridization experiments, or things that we can observe in nature. And the other source of evidence is the fossil record. So I'm holding there a North Carolina mastodon. We don't have mastodons in North Carolina anymore. You don't have them out here, even though you got lots of snow. Modern organisms are different from fossil organisms, and different types of fossils occur in rocks of different ages. So I want to present some of this evidence to you now, and we'll start with laboratory tests. Evolution, if you talk to a geneticist, the geneticist is probably going to say it's change in the genetic makeup of a population. And such evolution has been observed in the laboratory. I've got some fruit flies here, 2 fruit flies. And fruit flies are good laboratory animals. They reproduce rapidly, easy to study. They've shown genetic change in virtually every aspect of their anatomy, dozens of different traits. Body size, DDT resistance, developmental rate. Here's a difference in wing number. This guy here has a bithorax mutation. It's got 2 sets of wings compared to this guy. So evolution is something that we can see in the laboratory. Evolution is a fact. Breeding and hybridization experiments have produced lots of new varieties, faster racehorses, plumper turkeys, sweeter corn. You guys like corn, right? We're in Iowa, corn. Okay, yeah. That's evolution. Artificial breeding has produced all varieties of dog, from Chihuahuas to St. Bernards. This is a golden doodle. I never heard of golden doodles before my brother-in-law and his wife got a golden doodle. This is Winston. And these varieties of dogs have evolved from a common wolf-like ancestor. Now, I've heard people say, I don't believe in evolution. Well, to me, that's just like saying, I don't believe in golden doodles. Okay, golden doodles exist, and they exist because of evolution. Well, that's human-induced evolution, but we've observed similar or greater changes in nature. Half the 500 or so crop-damaging insects have evolved resistance to insecticides. We know that disease-causing microorganisms are constantly evolving resistance to antibiotics. That's why we have to get flu shots every year. So saying I don't believe in evolution is like saying I don't believe in the flu. Even more extensive changes have been observed in nature, including evolution of new species. And prime examples are viruses that cause AIDS, viruses that cause parvo. I've got a list of these here. Parvo, have you heard of parvo? It's a disease that affects dogs. Actually, it originally affected cats. It caused feline distemper in cats, and then it evolved to actually be, initially it was fatal for dogs. Now I understand that it can be passed on more easily. It's less virulent than it was previously. But those are new species. All right, but you're going to say those are just viruses. You know, we can't even see them. What about things that we can see? Well, all right, new plant species have evolved through human intervention. Iris, corn, there's corn again. So, saying I don't believe in evolution is like saying I don't believe in corn. And nobody in Iowa would say that, right? Okay, but those are just plants. What about animals? Well, okay, we've got examples of new species of animals that have evolved. Here's a species of butterfly that was recently produced in the laboratory by hybridization experiments. And it appears to be the same species as one that's found in nature and was thought to have evolved through natural hybridization. Another example is a moth that's found in Hawaii. There's 5 species of this moth, Hetelepta, that are found only in Hawaii. So they must have evolved there, must have originated there. They're found only on banana trees. That's all they can eat. But we know that bananas have only been in Hawaii for the last 1,000 years. So that has to imply that those 5 species have evolved on Hawaii, in Hawaii, over those last 1,000 years. All right, but those are just bugs. Now, what about real animals? Well, in the last couple years, new species of birds have been found. This is a new species of finch that's found in the Galapagos, where Darwin did his work. And this new species has formed since 1981 by hybridization of pre-existing species. New species of fish have been discovered. So evolution is a fact that we can observe happening all around us. Sometimes we ourselves cause it. Now, the other source of evidence for change in life through time is the fossil record. Fossils provide evidence of change in organisms over long, long periods of time, during prehistoric time. The sedimentary rocks of the world preserve the record of life that was alive during the time that these rocks formed. And these rocks are in layers, as we can see in the Grand Canyon, or on a smaller scale. This is a sediment core. We're looking at 2 sections through it. And there's little thin layers here, little laminations. Each of those is a layer of mud that's settled out in quiet water, 1 layer per year. So layers represent single events or single episodes of deposition. And the comparative ages of these rock layers was worked out more than 200 years ago. In fact, it's been about 400 years since geologists figured out how to determine the relative ages of rock layers. Geologists, you've heard of this? Have you heard of this? Geology 100 or whatever class you're in, the principle of superposition? Raise your hand if you've heard of the principle of superposition. All right, okay. So, layers get younger as you go which direction? As you go up, that's right. So, we've known this since 1660. And therefore, the sequence of rocks was worked out long before Darwin was even born. And if you go and work your way by superposition upwards in the rock sequence, you can see that the fossils in these rocks change systematically upward, indicating change in life through time. So the oldest rocks are about 4 billion years old or so, dated by radioactivity, and they don't have any fossils in them. But the first single-celled microorganisms appear higher in the rock sequence in rocks that are about 3.5 billion years old. And as we work our way upward, life forms change. We get soft-bodied multicellular organisms like worms and jellyfish, and then eventually we get shelled invertebrates, And then still higher, we get vertebrates, starting with fish and working our way upwards to find amphibians, reptiles, mammals. And only at the very top of the sequence do we find humans. So to me, the evidence is clear. Organisms have changed through time. Evolution has taken place. It's a fact. Life has changed through time. Now, we can use the term evolution in another way as an explanation for these patterns of change over time. And the description that we use for this is descent with modification from common ancestors. Darwin actually didn't even use the word evolution to start off with. He talked about descent with modification. Now, this is a theory. But remember I said that theories aren't just guesses. That's the way we use it in the vernacular. My husband will say, I have a theory for what's causing my psoriasis or whatever. He means guess, but that's not what scientists mean. When we say theory, we mean a well-tested explanation of facts. So the theory of evolution, I think, is the only viable scientific theory for change in life through time. It's not the only scientific theory, not the only scientific hypothesis, I should say. Other explanations have been proposed for these changes in life. For instance, the idea of flood geology, all of the rock record being formed by a single flood. That was an idea that was popular in the 1700s, early 1800s. By the 1830s, before anybody was talking about evolution to speak of, this idea was rejected by geologists because the sequence of layers and fossils is too complex. We have all these different environments represented, and they don't occur in an order, nor do the fossils, that make sense to attribute to deposition from a single flood. Okay, so I won't talk any more about that now, but I want to go on and talk about the evidence that supports the theory of descent from common ancestors. So what facts support the theory of evolution? Well, all organisms share the same chemistry and the same hereditary material, DNA and RNA, no matter whether we're talking about people or penguins or plants. DNA is made up of molecules, smaller molecules called nucleotides, and the same 4 nucleotides are present in all organisms. There are other nucleotides that exist, so different species could use different codes, but the genetic code is the same for all of life, so an indication of common ancestry. However, not all species are equally similar. Those that the fossil record shows are the most closely related have the most similarities. So, for example, baboons and humans both have opposable thumbs, and we both like Pringles. Humans and chimps, our DNA is 99% the same. I think that's incredible. Cytochrome C is another good example. It's a molecule that's used in cell metabolism. It's made up of 104 smaller molecules called amino acids. This chart compares us to other organisms and looking at how many mutations would be responsible for the difference in our amino acids. So humans and chimps have no difference. We've got the same 104 amino acids. If we compare us to rhesus monkey, it's different by 1 out of 104. These are averages. Horses would be different from us by 11. Tuna fish are different by 21. So, the organisms that the fossil record shows are more distantly related, are more different from one another. Okay, but if the fossil record, if organisms are related by descent, then the fossil record should show transitions from one to another, ancestor to descendant. Now, preservation isn't something that happens very easily. It's actually hard to fossilize something. There's a lot of things that can destroy a specimen before it becomes a fossil. But even with that being the case, there are a lot of good examples of transitional forms known. So I'll go through a few of the famous ones. Probably the most famous is the oldest known bird fossil, Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx is interesting. Its skeleton is really similar to that of a small carnivorous dinosaur. It's only the fact that feather impressions have been preserved that people realized in the 1800s, 1860s, that this was actually a bird. So Archaeopteryx had feathers and a wishbone, like birds, but it had a long tail, it had teeth, and in general its skeleton was really that of a dinosaur. So it's a transitional form between dinosaurs and birds, and there have been exceptionally preserved fossils found in recent years, especially in China, that indicate that some small carnivorous dinosaurs also had feathers. So you can see them here on the back of this guy's neck. Actually, this species, they've now determined the color of those feathers by preservation of the pigment-forming structures. And we know this guy had orange and white stripes on his tail. Isn't that cool? That's really cool, I think. Here's another feathered dinosaur that we saw when we visited China. You can see the feathers on its neck. So there's a strong link between dinosaurs and birds. So I'll show you another transitional sequence. This is one between fish and amphibians. Now, when I was, when I first started teaching, we had this guy, this fish, Eusthenopteron, which was a fish that was able to breathe air, and had some mobility on land. I've been up since, I left my house at 4 a.m., so that's 3 a.m. your time. So if I don't make any sense at all, just kind of forgive me. Okay, so that's that guy. Then higher in the rock record, younger rocks, we have a guy called Ichthyostega, which is definitely an amphibian, but it's got some fish characteristics, scales and a tail fin and stuff like that. That was what was known 30 years ago. In recent years, the gap has been filled with all kinds of new finds, and this doesn't even show them all. So here's that one, and here's that one. Now we have all these intermediates. Tiktaalik is a particularly famous discovery found a few years ago. It's a fish, but it's got a neck, it's got a shoulder, it's got wrist bones, it's got eyes on the top of its head. It's a very amphibian-like fish. And in fact, the discoverer refers to it as a fishapod because it's a fish, but, it's a fish, but it's got tetrapod, four-footed animal characteristics. This guy, Ted Deschler, this made such a splash that he was interviewed on the Colbert Report, so you know this was a big discovery beyond paleontology. Okay, well, there are a lot of sequences like this for all kinds of transitions between major groups, amphibians to reptiles, reptiles to mammals, also in a lot of lineages of organisms. So I'll show you a few examples. Triceratops, to paraphrase Napoleon Dynamite, is pretty much my favorite dinosaur. And Triceratops got this beak, it's got this frill, and it's got 3 horns. That's where the Triceratops 3-horned face comes from. 45 million years previously, we've got this guy, Psittacosaurus. He's got the beak. And then we've got Monoclonius, beak and frill. And then we end up with a guy with 1 horn and a couple rudimentary horns over the eyes. And these are just some of the species in the horned dinosaur group of dinosaurs. So lots of relatives to Triceratops in the fossil record. Whales are another good example. We can trace whales back to ancestors on land. We know they're whales based on their skull structure, but the early whales have 4 limbs and had mobility on land. Here's another recent find. This is an early whale, 47 million years ago from Pakistan, and we know that this whale came to shore to give birth. We can tell that because of the orientation of the fetus. It doesn't really show here, but based on the way the fetus is oriented, we know that she had to have given birth on land. And something else that I think is interesting, a few years ago, a dolphin was fished up I guess you can fish dolphins, in Japan. And this dolphin had hind legs, remnants of hind legs. Dolphins do not have hind legs. But it's in their genome. They're related to whales, and they still have the potential to grow those hind legs. Horse evolution is another example that's well documented in the fossil record. We see an increase in size, we see an increase in the height of the teeth, and a decrease in the number of toes. And those are all related to natural selection pressure as environments shifted from forest to grasslands. All right, but those aren't what we really care about. What we really care about are people, right? Well, there's a lot of fossils that look a lot like us. There are a lot of species that precede us in the fossil record. Some are thought to be ancestral to us. Others probably were evolutionary dead ends. But I want to show you some of the highlights, just not nearly all of them. This is Sahelanthropus. It's about 6 to 7 million years old, and it shares a lot of characteristics with both humans and chimps. It's thought to be close to the time that humans and chimp lines split off from one another, but it looks like it walked upright. How can we tell? Well, we can look at the hip bone structure. Here's another species that's just a little bit younger. This is Aurora tugenensis. That's its hip bone. This is a chimp, and these are members of, over here, our genus, the genus Homo. This hip bone, leg bone, is a lot more similar to us than it is to chimps. Here's a find that was written up about 2 years ago now. Ardipithecus ramidus. We're getting younger in the fossil record. This is an animal that clearly spent a lot of time in the trees still, but when it was on the ground, its feet were used for propulsion. So it was able to walk upright also. And another example, Australopithecus afarensis. This is the species that Lucy, the famous Lucy, belongs to. This is an even more complete skeleton. This is a little girl, 3 years old, and she has a nearly complete skeleton. The lower body was very human-like. She walked upright. We know this from footprints, too, of these Australopithecus animals. But the upper body was very ape-like. So we've got a lot of transitions that we can see. This is more Australopithecus. There are transitions in the hip bone structure of Australopithecus between apes and humans. The jaw structure, the shape of the jaw, it's U-shaped in chimps. It's more parabolic in humans. And Australopithecus is intermediate between us. If you look at the skull, you can see a whole series of changes involving increase in brain size, flattening of the face as you go through time. And I'm skipping a lot of species, but there we are. And in general, starting with Australopithecines, 3.5 million years ago, to modern time, you can see the increase in brain size that has occurred. So in my judgment, I think there's abundant evidence for human evolution. Okay, now a final usage of the word evolution is a mechanism to explain descent with modification. And in this sense, we also want to use the term theory. This is a particularly active area of research. We understand a lot about it, but there's still details that are being worked out. Part of my research, personal research, has been involved in studying this also. I'm going to focus on one aspect of how evolution takes place because I think natural selection, Darwin's contribution, is one of the most misunderstood ideas, even though I think it's very simple. It's just a logical conclusion based on 3 simple observations. So let's look at these. First observation is that within species, you have variation from one individual to another. So, yeah, that used to be me, and here's my little boy who's now 28, so this was a while ago. He's looking adoringly at Dopey, I don't know why, but you can see Dopey looks rather different than Timothy and I do. You know, he's got these really big ears, and his proportions are kind of weird. I think he's only got 4 digits. Okay, so we got variation within our species. That's a silly example, I know, but I hope you get the point. Okay, next, this variation is inherited through our DNA and RNA. So here's me and here's my baby girl, and 30 years ago, I looked exactly like she does now. It's kind of spooky to see that. My son, Timothy, and I both have this dimple in our chin. He's still got it. My father had it. Okay? We resemble our biological parents. Okay, third observation. Organisms produce more offspring than can survive. Now, I have an example here, a busy street in China. My son taught English there for a year after college. And we have a human overpopulation problem. And no, he's not standing on anything. Now, humans are actually slow reproducers. A female oyster can produce 600 million offspring in her lifetime. That's a lot of oysters. You probably don't eat oysters here, do you? Not much. We eat oysters in North Carolina. If all those offspring survived, by the third generation there'd be a pile of oyster shells 8 times the size of the Earth. So clearly, not every baby oyster or baby human or baby anything is going to be able to survive. So the result of this, the consequence of those 3 things, is natural selection. Since not everybody can survive, on average, the variations that do survive and get passed on are those that are best fitted to the environment. So my example here, so here we are still in China. Suppose the last piece of food was growing on this tree in that part of China. Who's going to get it? Which variation is going to survive? My son is looking rather smug at this point. Not everybody can survive. There's a lot of variation out there, and just on average, those that do survive are those that are best fitted to the environment. So the process is similar to what happens in artificial selection, in breeding and hybridization experiments. There's already variation present in the population, and the corn growers in Iowa pick, the corn with the biggest ears, the fullest ears, and they use those to reproduce. And you get bigger, better corn, right? Okay, that's happened, right? Okay, well, nature does exactly the same thing. So in nature, organisms are selected for a variety of ways. Maybe that they're better able to acquire and use resources. Maybe that lion is better at catching its prey. Or maybe, not this one, but maybe the other one that is not in the picture that got away was better to escape its predator or disease or change in the environment. Or maybe they just reproduce a whole lot better, a lot faster, more babies, faster. So those are the kinds of things that are favored by natural selection. Now, when the environment changes, natural selection will work with the variations that are already present in the environment and produce a new combination, put together a new combination adapted to the new environment. So, today, natural selection is very well accepted. There's lots of evidence for it. The debate is not over whether evolution by natural selection occurs, but the debate is focusing on such things as how rapidly does it occur? Does evolution occur episodically or gradually? That's part of what my research has been involved in. What other mechanisms might be involved in evolution? This debate doesn't imply any weakness in evolution, as some people have suggested, but instead it points to the strength of evolution as a science, as an idea that's constantly being studied and revised and improved. So I think evolution is the best scientific explanation for the history of life. It's not a tower of speculation about to collapse. And don't ask me why the minister's son is building towers out of beer cans. Okay. Well, I want to switch gears now, go back to the question that we posed at the beginning. How do I reconcile my acceptance of evolution? Because I do accept it. I think there's very strong evidence for evolution, including human evolution. How do I reconcile that with my Christian faith? Does the Bible present a view of creation that's incompatible with evolution? Well, let me start off by saying that I believe the Bible is the Word of God, and it is authoritative in my life. However, I'm not a biblical literalist. I once heard a Presbyterian minister comment that Presbyterians think the biblical message is too important to be taken literally. And if you take it literally, you lose a lot of the powerful meaning of the stories. So that's where I'm coming from theologically. I don't believe that God dictated every word of the Bible, but I believe that the Bible is God's word in human words. And actually, I don't think a truly literal translation of the Bible is possible. Modern biblical scholarship shows that the biblical texts have a really complex history. The oldest consistent Old Testament texts come from the 1st century A.D. When they were originally written down, there were no vowels or punctuation. Now, imagine trying to read your geology textbook without any vowels or punctuation. I mean, you think it's hard now. Okay, imagine that. The vowels weren't added until the 9th and 10th century A.D., 1,000 years or more after the original texts were written down. So, as a result, the original meaning of the Hebrew text is obscure in a lot of places. There's a gentleman in our community who has been involved in translating the Old Testament. You know, my Bible, his name is on the front page of it. And he's held Bible studies at our church. He says, you know, this place here, we really don't know what they're saying here. We don't know what this passage means. So you have to interpret. You can't have a completely literal translation. All translations have to be interpretations to some extent because of these problems with the Hebrew text. Now, actually, I don't believe that I believe that when we're making these interpretations, we have to be conservative. Since all translations involve interpretation, what we should try to do is conserve the intentions of the original texts. And I'm getting these ideas here from Conrad Hires. He's an Old Testament scholar. He taught at Gustavus Adolphus for many years, and he's got a wonderful book called The Meaning of Creation. So he argues that we have to try to figure out what the original intentions were for the biblical stories. So the question I pose is, were the biblical creation stories intended to be historical, scientific, literal accounts of creation? And to paraphrase Duane Gish, the creationist, I think the Bible says no, exclamation point. So, now, why do I think this? Well, several reasons. For one thing, there are two distinct creation stories in Genesis. Genesis 1 is the familiar, God said, let there be whatever, and there was whatever, and God saw that whatever was very good. The other one is the Adam and Eve story. So these stories date from a different time. They represent different concerns, different contexts, according to biblical scholars. Genesis 1 is actually the newer of the two stories. It comes from the 6th century BC. This was the time when the Hebrews were in exile in Babylon. Its focus is on the origin of the universe, the earth, its inhabitants. Interestingly, it has certain parallels to contemporaneous, maybe I should say, Babylonian stories, not creation stories. The Babylonians had procreation stories because basically in the Babylonian stories you have all these gods and goddesses, and they are begetting other gods and goddesses. But the Babylonian story, this is the Enuma Elish, is divided into 7 tablets, and if you look at it closely, there are a lot of parallels between the Babylonian story and the Genesis story. So biblical scholars have argued that the similarities between Genesis 1 and the contemporary Mesopotamian creation stories indicate that Genesis 1 was written down in repudiation of these rival stories. So Genesis 1 was trying to affirm that there was one God, the Creator, the omnipotent Creator. Genesis 1 is undermining all the temptations to idolatry that must have been occurring when the Hebrews were in exile in this country where there were all these different gods that were worshipped. So that's been interpreted as the purpose of Genesis 1, affirm monotheism, one God, the Creator God. Now, Genesis 2 also argues against idolatry, but from a different context. Genesis 2 is the older of the two stories. It was written down in the 10th century BC during the time of King Solomon. And this is Notre Dame in Paris, and these are all the Hebrew kings, so Solomon is one of those. And you can take your pick. I don't know which one he is. But anyway, the focus of Genesis 2 is really different. It's concerned with humans primarily, but again, the purpose is the same, to reject temptations to idolatry, which were also very strong in Solomon's day. So Solomon's known for being really wise. He also had a whole lot of wives and a whole lot of concubines, and they weren't all nice Jewish girls. So they all had their own idols that they were worshiping on the mountainsides. And so Genesis 2 is arguing against the temptations to idolatry that existed during that time that stemmed from Solomon's marriage to various foreign wives. So the two Genesis stories are different in many details. As I said, they're different in context. They use a different language. God has a different name in the two versions. The mode of creation is different. Genesis 1, God commands and it happens. Genesis 2, what's God doing? Well, he's down there in the mud. He's making stuff. Oh, there's this really good Gary Larson cartoon. It's called, the caption is, God makes the snake. And this is what God is doing. And he says, these things are a cinch. So there you go. Mode of creation is different. A lot of details are different. Genesis 1, there's too much water. God has to separate it from the earth. Genesis 2, there's not enough water. God has to water the earth. The whole sequence of creation is different in Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1, here's the sequence, vegetation, sun, moon, stars, birds and fish, and then land animals. And male and female are created last of all and simultaneously. Genesis 2 assumes the sun, moon, and stars are there. Then man, literally man, is made. Then plants, animals, and finally woman. So the Hebrew authors who juxtaposed these texts weren't concerned about the inconsistencies among them. These contradict, but they didn't care. And to me, this suggests that the Genesis stories were not intended to be taken as scientific historical accounts of creation. And I think this point of view is reinforced by the presence of additional, much different creation stories in other places, in Proverbs, in Job, in Psalms. Now, I don't believe that this view demeans the biblical accounts in any way. I think that just because a story is not factual, not historically accurate, that doesn't mean it's false. I think there can be deep truths in non-factual accounts, non-historical accounts. And so I view the Genesis stories as statements of faith by the Hebrew people, faith in one God creator, and I share that faith. Now, while I'm at it, I also want to mention that since the biblical accounts were not intended as science, I'm strongly opposed to the teaching of creation science, scientific creationism, in public school science classes. Creationism, in any of its permutations, including intelligent design, is not science. Its explanations are supernatural. They're not based on natural law. The ideas are based on faith, not on the scientific method. If we say it's science, then it has to obey the rules of science, and I've already said that by definition, the conclusions of science are tentative. They're open. They always have to be open to further testing. So personally, I'm offended by the idea that faith issues should be open to testing by the scientific method. I don't think creationists want their beliefs to depend on the outcome of a scientific test any more than I do either. So I find the whole concept of creation science very puzzling. I also think that the concept of intelligent design has more potential to do harm to religion than to science. So intelligent design was developed in the 1990s in response to the court cases in the 1980s that ruled the teaching of creationism unconstitutional. So it avoids those overt religious references. It's based largely on the concept of irreducible complexity promoted by Michael Behe, the idea that life forms are too complex to have developed through natural process of evolution and therefore had to have begun abruptly through an intelligent agent. Oh, there's Johnny Depp. Okay, why is Johnny Depp there? Well, I have a Johnny Depp obsession, I have to confess. But what's he doing here? Well, he's got a watch on, and the caption is "Time is precious." Okay, the watch. Intelligent designers use the watch as one of their icons. If you find a watch, you're walking along in the woods and you find a watch, you pick it up and you realize that can't be a natural thing. Okay, it's too complicated. Someone must have made it. They say the same thing about nature. There are certain structures that are too complex to have formed naturally. Okay. So we've gotten into this big debate about should intelligent design creationism be taught in public schools, and there have been lots of arguments about this, constitutionality issues, but a lot of them come down to the question of is ID science or religion, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. Right now I want to consider the dangers of intelligent design. First of all, I think intelligent design could potentially be a danger to science, because intelligent design identifies these too complex structures, irreducibly complex structures, and so then you can just say, well, the intelligent designer made it, and we don't have to study it anymore. Okay, it's a science stopper. And here's a mousetrap. That's another icon that they use. They say that a mousetrap, if you take out any of its pieces, it won't work anymore. Well, it won't work as a mousetrap, but it could work as a tie clip or all kinds of things. So that's why that icon is there. But that's not what I want to focus on now. So a structure is so complicated, we say, okay, an intelligent designer made it. Well, then technically we shouldn't have to study it anymore. But actually what happens is that, we have a danger to religion also, because we see these irreducibly complex structure, and scientists don't want to give up, so they're not just going to say, well, okay, a designer made it, we don't have to study it. So they start looking at it in detail, and suddenly they start finding all kinds of evolutionary precursors that intelligent design proponents claim shouldn't exist. So where does that leave God? Well, it's like saying, I can't explain this naturally, so I'll say God did it. And then you find a natural explanation for it, and there's no need to bring in God anymore. So the space for God to act in gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So I'm very much opposed to the approach of intelligent design. I think ultimately its effect will be to inhibit religion rather than to advance it as its inventors intend. But either way, go back to the question, is it science or religion? Well, it's been judged in federal court to be a religious concept. Therefore, the teaching of intelligent design in public schools has been ruled unconstitutional. And actually, as a Christian, I say thank God for that. And if my kids were still in school, I would not want them to be learning their religion from a public school teacher. I want them sitting in that front row listening to their dad preach, okay? I won't say anymore. Okay, so, all right, well, let me wind up now. If I believe in God as creator, then how do I fit in my views on evolution? So, speaking now not as a scientist, but as a person of faith, to me, evolution is God's means of creating. I don't view creation as an episode that was confined to 6 days at the beginning of time. I see creation as an ongoing process. To me, God's creativity has spanned billions of years, and it's not over yet. I don't find this view threatening in any way, nor do a variety of religious leaders and organizations, from Roman Catholics to Jews to Protestants. All of these groups and more have issued statements, either, here's a few samples, either supporting evolution or opposing the teaching of scientific creationism in public schools. So there are many of us, religious persons, religious scientists, religious folks of all stripes, many religious organizations that all agree that evolution and the Bible don't need to conflict. So I find this view of God much more powerful than a view of God as a creator who was active for a few days and then called it quits. I also find it compatible with the evidence presented to me by my scholarly work, and it's also consistent with the ideas of many other persons of faith. So, for me, evolution does not threaten my faith. In fact, it gives me a glimpse into the incredible power of God to create. Thank you.
We have time for questions, but before we begin, let me make this announcement. We'll have a small reception after we're done here, so those interested, please stay a few minutes. We can arrange it this way. If you can speak loud enough and everybody can hear it, that's fine. If not, we have a person with a microphone who will be going around.
Hi, my name is Zach.
Hi, Zach.
I was just wondering about the transitional fossils. How many of those transitional fossils do we find? Like, you mentioned Lucy, right? Like, how many of those do geologists dig up in a year? Is that the only one we have, or that bird fossil between the dinosaur and the bird? Is that the only one they found, or like how many are there?
Oh, how many specimens of those?
Yeah.
Archaeopteryx? Well, Archaeopteryx, think about birds. They don't fossilize very well. They've got hollow bones. But there are now 10 Archaeopteryx specimens in existence. Tiktaalik, there are a bunch of specimens. I don't know exactly how many. I think like 27 or something. There's a whole bunch in a single deposit. It's not just single specimens. And for invertebrates, I didn't talk about invertebrate examples because, they're not as much fun, according to most people, as vertebrates are. But invertebrates, there's tons of invertebrates in the fossil record. Vertebrates, in general, are more rare as fossils, but most of these things have multiple specimens. Good question. This one up there.
You mentioned that there are other possible mechanisms in addition to natural selection. If you mentioned any, I missed
No,
them
I didn't.
all.
I didn't.
But could you
this is probably something that anybody here from an introductory biology class? Okay, a few of those. You probably talk about other mechanisms in there, maybe things like genetic drift, gene flow, things like that, that are involved in changing the genetic composition of a species. So there are other mechanisms also. There's even, some people are kind of neo-Lamarckian. That's an issue that continues to raise every now and then inheritance of acquired characteristics. I don't follow that literature very closely, but other mechanisms have been proposed and talked about.
I have a question about the conflict. If evolution provides this explanation for how all living organisms came to be, then what is left for the God that you conceive of to do? What does he actually? If evolution produces all these things, then what does God do? What's he in charge of?
Well, I guess I I see evolution as the work of God. So I see God in evolution. That's not answering your question, is it? Right. Well, I think, actually, I believe in a God, if we want to get into this, I believe in a God who works through natural processes, not through supernatural processes. And that makes my statement that I think God is working through evolution a statement of faith rather than, I mean, it's not something that you can test. It is faith. But I see God as a God who has worked through natural processes.
Can you give that a name?
Well, we might call it theistic evolution. There are a number of us people who, I have a lot of colleagues, paleontology colleagues, who are, elders in the Presbyterian Church and, things like that. They're very much, very, very much active in their faith. But also, they do their research on evolution, and I would call us theistic evolutionists, I guess we could say. Certainly in my scientific study, I don't bring in the explanation of God. I've never published a paper with scientific results. I've written lots of papers on evolution and patterns of evolution in my mollusks, and I've never said, and oh, by the way, I think God did that. I can't say that. I can't test that. And another layer of complexity, life is the world is complex. These are tough issues to grapple with. And, I'm not a theologian, I get it by osmosis from my husband. But, yeah.
Okay. For a person of, I would say you believe in faith and science as well. So, just to clarify more, for a geology student, the concept of heaven and hell, then, is it to be taken literally or is interpretation?
I think people have different views of heaven and hell. I think the Bible presents varying views of heaven and hell. The Bible presents varying images of God. Some of the images of God are God as Father. There are other images in the Bible of God as Mother. So I think the Bible is not consistent in what it depicts. I don't think there's a unified picture, of any of these concepts. I think God is probably all of those things and more than those things. I don't know. Does that am I making any sense still, or am I in La La Land somewhere? Been up a long time.
One more question. You would agree that evolution makes things more complex, right? As things go along, things get more complex, correct?
Not necessarily. That's a big debate in paleontology right now, and maybe in evolutionary biology in general. My PhD advisor, Stephen Jay Gould, always argued that things weren't getting more complex. Yes, there were a few lines that got more complex, but still most of the world is bacteria, and they haven't gotten more complex. So that's a big issue right now in paleontology. How much directionality is there? Has there been in the history of life?
For a theological kind of approach, that it's directed toward the more complex. If the organisms survive, if we have a bunch of individuals with IQs of 10 walk around and beat us all down with clubs, they survive much more better in this environment. So I don't think there's any teleological approach to religion at all, or to evolution at all.
You're all such a quiet audience. You're so polite. My students aren't this polite back in North Carolina.
Yeah, it's my understanding that the first few books of the Bible were written down by Moses. Now, do you agree with
There
that?
are some scholars, generally fundamentalist scholars, that would argue that. The scholars that I'm familiar with, for instance, the guy from my hometown that has translated the Bible would not argue that. It would say that there are a variety of sources, and these sources have been given different abbreviations. There's the J source, and I can't even say them all. But for instance, the Genesis 2 and the Genesis 1 story, because of their different languages, the different names that are used for God, are considered to have represented different sources. So the modern biblical scholarship that I have read does not agree with that.
Okay, well, I don't. As far as the opposition between the two chapters, I think that can be argued.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories that fall into the Genesis 2 source. For instance, I think, and I haven't studied this in a long time, but I think, for instance, the Tower of Babel story and some of those sections of Genesis are from that source, whereas other sections are from other sources. It's just like in the New Testament, when you look at the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, drew on different materials also, and some things you find in more than one Gospel, some things are only in one Gospel. There's only one miracle, I think, that's in all four Gospels, and I think that's the feeding of the 5,000. So different sources, different source material put together to form a unified whole.
I just want to suggest for an opposing viewpoint, there's a website, answersingenesis.org.
Yes.
So,
Yes, that's correct. Uh-huh.
I have a question about chance. If my existence is all ruled by chance, does chance rule my every possible smallest amount of time?
I didn't quite understand your question. Does chance what?
If the universe came into existence through chance, does chance rule by every smallest amount of time?
Interesting. Let me, I want to draw on this biblical scholar that I've mentioned, Conrad Hyers, before, and he actually recognizes that evolution does talk some about chance. We talk about random mutations. That doesn't mean that they don't have a cause. That doesn't, am I saying this right? That doesn't mean that they don't have a cause. They do have a cause, but they're random with respect to future usefulness. It's generally thought that a mutation occurs and it may turn out to be helpful, may turn out to be harmful, but it's not future usefulness that causes that mutation to occur. So mutations are considered random in that sense. Now, what Hyers, this Old Testament scholar, has argued is that the Bible actually presents a view of God in which randomness is actually important. And he contrasts the Genesis 1 view with the Genesis 2 view. In the Genesis 1 view, God is presented as very powerful, very commanding, very autocratic. God has it all planned out. God says, let there be, and there was. The Genesis 2 view is a different view of creativity that involves more experimentation, more randomness. And he argues that that's an equally valid view of creativity. And in fact, over time, if you look at artists, there have been different artists who have purposely, and maybe this is a contradiction, purposely introduced randomness into their work. For instance, he gives examples of Chinese artists that grew their beards really long and then would dip their beards in paint and paint with it. Or look at Jackson Pollock, okay? We call that creativity. There's a lot of randomness in that. So he views God as a God who, as part of God's nature, employs the random, employs the chance as part of creativity. I think that's a really interesting view. He's got his book is entitled "The Meaning of Creation," and it's at probably out of print now, but maybe you can find it in the library or on Amazon or something. It's a really fun and meaningful discussion of some of these issues.
Given all that you've said tonight, what parts of the Bible do you take literally, and what parts do you believe are simply stories to help people live better, like moral lives?
Well, I wouldn't want to go line by line and say this is literal, this is... I mean, there are some historical accounts that are backed up with archaeological evidence or whatever. I view all of the Bible as truth, but as I said before, truth doesn't have to be factual. So. Sure, I'll be happy to talk to people individually during the reception also.
Okay, so what is your scientific and your personal belief about the origin of life? Are they different? How can you reconcile them?
Of the origin of life? Yeah, I should point out that evolution really doesn't deal with the origin of life. Evolution only deals with life once it's here. Well, I teach about the origin of life. I think it's a very active area of research right now. I think we have good evidence for some of the hypothesized steps in the early history of life. Going back to the Urey Miller experiment and all that, we've been able to synthesize organic molecules through inorganic processes. We've been able to combine simple organic molecules to form more complex organic molecules. We've even been able to produce cell-like structures. So I think we have a good scenario for how it happened. I think it happened I can see it happening through natural processes. We haven't been able to replicate that last step, and I think that's good. I think it would be really dangerous if humans started producing life out of inorganic materials. So I see a scenario, a natural scenario that makes sense, but to me, I see that also as God working through natural processes. But of course, I don't teach that part of it in my science class.
How have you overcome, other people's views about, how you believe in God and Christianity, and then you also, can believe in evolution? How can you get past all those people's opinions about people?
So which opinions in particular? Are you saying people who...
Just like people who are, really Christian, or people who don't believe in Christianity, and then...
So both sides of the issue. Yeah. Well, I keep my science as my science, so things don't enter there. But then when I begin to talk to people individually, I don't talk about the religious aspects in class, but when I start to teach about evolution, I actually say to my students, this is something I'm really interested in. I've written articles, I've edited books on this subject. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. Please come and see me in my office if you want to talk about it. And I've also taught honors classes that are more interdisciplinary and go into these issues more. And I think I don't necessarily want to bring people around to my way of thinking. I don't think everybody has to think exactly like me. But I want students in particular to have the freedom to know that one doesn't have to exclude the other. I've known students who have said to me, well, I want to be a scientist and therefore, I can't be religious. Or other students who said, well, I'm a Christian and so I can't be a scientist. I want people to be able to consider the possibility that the two don't have to conflict. And maybe we won't come around to the same point of view. I remember the first time I taught an honors course, one of the students who was extremely religious, who basically said to me at the end of the course, the Holy Spirit has still convicted me, of creation without evolution, and I can't accept what you said, but at least now I know that you don't have to be an atheist to accept evolution. And, praise the Lord when somebody has a deep faith like that. I'm always glad to meet people who share my faith. I also have many friends who are atheists, and I respect their opinion also. I don't know, maybe I've said enough. Maybe I should stop.
Thank you, Professor Kelly, for coming.